I know. Not that you have faith.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpenka, and I am the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Just to note that the event is being live streamed to our YouTube page, so please be aware of the webcam behind you. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society's latest release, Points of View, a guide on Saskatchewan Projectile Points with Indigenous Perspectives, edited by Faith Boser. Speaking to us tonight, we have contributors Gabriel Lamarche and Tomasin Playford. Thank you both for being here. I'd also like to thank Belinda for working with us to create this event. I'll now briefly introduce our guests. Gabriel Lamarche is a current master's student in archaeology at the University of Saskatchewan. He grew up around Georgian Bay on Lake Huron and has lived in Saskatchewan for most of his adult life. His first experience with archaeology was around age 12 on Boser Island, the one-time home of his Anishinaabe ancestors. He is now a well-practiced flint napper, and he is always eager to share his passion and interests in the ancient crafting traditions. He joins us tonight to share his vast knowledge of flint napping to highlight the complex knowledge systems involved in making stone tools. Tomasin Playford holds a PhD and is the executive director of the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society and adjunct professor in the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Saskatchewan. She has worked throughout Saskatchewan and Manitoba for the past 30 years with a focus on subsistence and seasonality during the late period. I'll now turn things over to her. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay. So thank you for joining us this evening. It's our absolute pleasure to share with you the story of our newest publication, Points of View, a guide on Saskatchewan Projectile Points with Indigenous Perspectives. So I too am going to begin this gathering with a land acknowledgement, and then I'll introduce myself and the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society. Then I'll explain how this book came to be and why we feel it's timely and important. And that's actually where I'm going to spend most of my time in my presentation. I will touch on a few key aspects of the book, but then I'm going to turn things over to Gabriel, who will share his vast knowledge of flint napping without actually doing it. So if anyone can do that, it is Gabe. We will be sure to leave some time at the end for questions, and we welcome you to come up and talk with us, take a look at the artifacts that we brought today. So where we are gathered here this evening is on the traditional territory of the Nehiwau, Naka, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Dene, and the homeland of the Métis. The signing of the treaties was an agreement between nations to share the bounties of this land. And it's important that we recognize all of our benefits and responsibilities under these agreements, that we acknowledge the harms and injustices of the past. Today, we affirm our commitment to focus our efforts on repairing the relationships between immigrant Canadians who have settled here over centuries and the First Nation people who have called this place home since time immemorial. We are committed to exploring our roles, whether it be individual, community, sectoral, or systematic, in perpetuating and maintaining colonial ideologies. We dedicate our efforts to working together in the spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. So my name is Tomasin Playford. I'm the executive director of the SAS. Career-wise, I just happened to be born in Brandon, Manitoba, where there was a professor who did local archaeology. His passion, mentorship, and dedication inspired me. It allowed me the opportunities to explore those connections between people and landscape through archaeology. Participating in field work at the undergraduate level in my own backyard spurred my interest, and I went on to do a master's degree here at the University of Saskatchewan. I returned back to Brandon to teach sessionally at BU and to do a little bit of research to work in community-based projects, and then I enrolled in a PhD program at the University of Manitoba. While there, I became very involved in the Manitoba Archaeological Society. I had always been very active in outreach and volunteerism as a student. I was always involved in my local archaeological community, conferences, open houses. And it was really that experience that led me to where I am right here today, working with the SAS. I had always said that if I won the lottery, my dream job would be to make a living doing what I was doing with the Manitoba Archaeological Society. It is a 100% volunteer-based organization, and so everything I was doing there, I was doing for free. But in a way, my dream came true. Here we have the Saskatchewan Lotteries Trust Fund for Sport, Culture, and Recreation. This directly funds 1,200 organizations, and the SAS happens to be one of them. It's a unique system in Canada where there's an agreement between the government and the sport, culture, recreation organizations to share the proceeds of lottery revenues. This means the SAS has the capacity for staff and for an office. We're located right here in Saskatoon, but we can deliver our programs and our services throughout the province. We support people and communities in the stewardship of archaeological heritage for our collective well-being. We are a charitable, nonprofit, membership-based organization, and we're actually going to celebrate our 60th anniversary this year. So we owe a debt of gratitude to all those who came before us. They laid the foundation by advocating for archaeology in our province. Today, we do this by connecting you to Saskatchewan's past. We want everyone to know about, understand, value, and respect the archaeological heritage here in Saskatchewan. Now, archaeology itself does have a complicated past. It's colonial. It originated on a separate continent. It's rooted in imperialism. It began during a time of conquest and nation building and developed alongside and as part of theoretical concepts of evolution and cultural hierarchies. It placed European civilization, note the air quotes, at the apex with all other societies below that. Archaeology carries that baggage, and I think is a way that we try to remove ourselves from it, is that archaeologists of my generation were predominantly trained to view archaeology strictly as a science. That is it. And it makes sense. There's a lot of science in archaeology, especially in the techniques and the methods we use. It has very strict rules. Science is unbiased. I won't get into a discussion about science, but it's supposed to be unbiased. But this also meant that I wasn't supposed to ascribe any type of humanistic characteristic to what I was studying. Projectile points weren't beautiful, handcrafted, awe-inspiring works of art. They were 98 millimeters long, 43 millimeters wide, 21 millimeters thick. They were made of SiO2, et cetera, et cetera. This also makes them very impersonal. The object of study becomes disconnected from the people who made them and the people who used them. And it actually has the potential to remove humanity from archaeology altogether. Because archaeology really is about studying people through the things, the material culture they leave behind. So this is a criticism of archaeology. It's archaeology for archaeologists only. But as times change, so too do our understandings and perspectives. And there's always been an element of that. There's always been an understanding that archaeology has to be for everyone. But there has been a mainstream shift in training, and we're seeing this in the studies, and certainly in that next generation of archaeologists. They no longer separate archaeological cultures as distinct, different, and removed from present-day Indigenous people. I don't want to give the impression that archaeology has never before included Indigenous people or perspectives. There are many instances and examples of early collaboration with Indigenous peoples and communities. What is different now is the scope. It's following the nothing about us without us approach. It's implementing Article 11 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Indigenous people have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to practice and revitalize, the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their culture, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. And that's what we feel is so different about this publication. It was a collaboration that incorporated Indigenous knowledge systems into archaeological practice. So the idea for a Saskatchewan Point book has probably been around for a while. We probably weren't the first people to think about it, but it was only after a couple of years when myself and my colleague Karen Stoiber joined the SAS in 2013 that we kind of noticed, hey, there's no Saskatchewan Projectile Point book. There's one for Manitoba, where I'm from. There's one for Alberta, where Karen's from. And all of us, myself, Belinda, and Karen, noticed that these guidebooks tended to be the very first publication someone new to archaeology or new to our organization would seek out. It was essentially dipping their toe into that cold lake of archaeology, so to speak. So as we kind of thought about doing one, we realized, but it couldn't be the same old thing. It couldn't just be archaeology for archaeologists. There had to be Indigenous inclusion, but we had no idea what that meant or what that might look like. We talked about it a lot with our friends, with our colleagues, and we brought it forward to the SAS Publication Committee late in about 2017. The committee agreed that it really couldn't move forward until we found partners to work with. And so I have to say, I feel it really started here with Gabriel, who at the time was an SAS board member and a member of the publications committee. He was keenly interested in this project. He understood the vision, I feel, right from the start, and recognized the authenticity of wanting to do this in the right way. Of course, this coupled with his experience in flintknapping just made it more than a no-brainer that he would be involved. We also knew Audrey Drever. She delivered a cultural perspectives workshop on projectile points for the Museums Association of Saskatchewan back in 2012. She was also an SAS member, and we had been communicating with her about artifacts in the SICC collection. We asked, and she was interested. We also had some in-house expertise. There was Frank McDougall, a retired geologist. He had already been brainstorming ways for us to create maps and to do the rock identification portion. But there was still a lot unknown and still a lot to do. We really didn't have a sense of how to marry the different perspectives. Would they be different sections? Would Indigenous and archaeological ideas be presented alongside each other? Everyone agreed that there was this need for the identification component, but it had to be more than that, and it had to reach audiences beyond archaeology. There was a lot of discussion. Do we include other artifact classes? Do we do other stone tools? So we did kind of settle on, we're just going to look at the points for now and go from there. But did we want to publish it ourselves? Did we want someone else to publish it? What were we going to do for illustrations and photos? And what point type chronology were we going to use? So that's a big discussion. We also needed to know who else has to be involved. Who is actually going to write it? And more so, who's actually going to pay for it? So these were some really tough questions we didn't have answers to. So we kind of put writing the book aside and we explored how to solve these questions. And this took time. We met with other publishers. We looked at a lot of other books. The committee had some good discussions that got some ideas of narrowing down the flow of the book. And we knew there had to be a diversity of Indigenous voices. Audrey and Gabriel would contribute chapters on their subject areas. Dr. Evelyn Siegfried joined the working committee. She was an SAS board member. She was also the curator of ethnology at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, retired since, but she was the perfect person to write about the care of collections. Having gone to school with Brian Scribe, he was actually at one of the first archaeological sites I'd ever worked on. He was again the perfect person to think about writing this section on connections between archaeology and landscape. Things were starting to come together, and we had the intention of making the Point Book our priority project for 2020. And we all know how that went. So we lost some momentum due to the pandemic, but we really do feel it was meant to be. Things happen when they're supposed to happen. During that time, we learned that a longtime SAS member, Mr. Ed Walker, had actually named the SAS as a beneficiary in his estate. This unexpected generosity and planned giving gave us the gift of this book. It meant the SAS had some of its own funds to dedicate to the project. It's always helpful when you can do that when applying for grants. And we did. We eventually were successful for Creative Saskatchewan Book Publishing Grant. We're grateful for that funding as it helped clarify processes for us too. With funding from Young Canada Works, Building Careers in Heritage, and Canada Summer Jobs, Faith Boser, a recent graduate from the U of S, was hired to serve as the editor. We could then leverage that funding into sponsorships from Globe, who printed our book, Can North Consulting, the Saskatchewan Association of Professional Archaeologists, and we can match some of that funding with an Arts Fest program. We also received some money from the McLean Foundation, and we did our own personal fundraising campaign where a lot of our own members contributed to the book. And this is when the effort really started. In the summer of 2021, everyone involved in the project are in agreement that this publication just wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for Faith. She learned Creative Suite, she helped design the layout, she did the color coordinations, she wrote a lot of the text, she took a lot of the photos, she liaisoned with the authors, she talked to collectors, archaeologists, curators to find the artifacts for the photos. And every artifact in this book is from Saskatchewan or it's a replica. Unfortunately, because Brian had experienced some health problems, he wasn't able to write, but we really didn't want to lose his voice in this publication. So Gabriel visited him and transcribed their discussion, and that is presented. It's chapter 4. We really wanted this book to be about Indigenous involvement, so we included Maria Mompe on our committee, and she reviewed the book and provided the foreword. We also did a search for and found an Indigenous illustrator who did the point illustrations. And then we also found an Indigenous graphic designer, Tim Neal, who did this beautiful cover work. He took our ideas of, we don't know what we want, we just know we don't want a picture of a projectile point on the front cover, but there is still a point there if you see it, and did this wonderful job of incorporating all our ideas into this artwork. Placement of the Indigenous author chapters first is deliberate. Audrey Drever sets the stage by sharing her views as an Indigenous artist in chapter 1. Stones are sacred beings, and projectile points are transformations from the landscape. They are sculpted, deliberately shaped. They are artistic. She places Indigenous art in the political context of Eurocentric notions of fine art and how this notion of what is or isn't art was imposed on Indigenous cultures. How it disconnected important artwork from Indigenous artists, whether that artwork was secular or sacred. Gabriel's chapter explains the complex, intricate, and highly challenging physics and geometry and math of flintknapping. It's so much more than simply bashing two rocks together. He eloquently and very skillfully describes the mechanisms of flintknapping. It's so much easier, though, to understand it when you see it. So that's why we've also included videos. There's a QR code at the front of the publication that will take readers to our YouTube page, where we have a series of short videos of Gabe flintknapping and explaining his processes. The third chapter is that interview between Brian and Gabe. Brian was one of the first Indigenous archaeologists in the province. He tells his story of where he comes from, the importance of the landscape and understanding the past. What shines through in Brian's interview is how Indigenous people's history is visible on the land, if you know what you're looking for. He very generously also shared the challenges he faced of being asked to do things he didn't feel comfortable doing. We need to listen. He's hopeful for the future and continues to share his knowledge with the youth in his community. Evelyn stressed the importance of responsible stewardship. She brought understanding of artifact collection and legislation to explain where artifacts go after they're excavated and how people with personal collections can be responsible stewards. Again, this is one of the reasons the book is needed now. So many people need to know what options exist for the collections that they have or that they are going to inherit from their parents or grandparents. And this is where the guide section becomes important. It starts with explaining how archaeologists interpret sites and artifacts and how we categorize projectile points. But it's really about those pictures. It's the inclusion of those point types from both the plains and the boreal forest and taiga. This is something else we wanted. We wanted the book to represent all of Saskatchewan. So often guidebooks tend to be biased towards the plain. So we wanted to make sure there was that northern representation. As I mentioned, each point has a line drawing by Cheyenne Lepkin, and each has a list of the distinctive traits for that point type. There's a descriptive write-up, and we also have maps of the distribution of the points across Saskatchewan. Wherever we could, we included a variety of examples to highlight the variability that can exist within each point type. There is also a section of other stone tools and lithic raw material types to help people identify what they have. You have to know what you have to care about it. The final chapter of the book is meant to dispel some of the myths and misconceptions people might have around archaeology and artifact collections. There is a fear that there will be taking away, and that's not what we want. We want people to think about where these items are going to go in the future, especially if they have no one in mind to look after them. These items, these artifacts, are those tangible pieces of Indigenous history. They are relatives, and they deserve to be cared for and respected as such. It's also a bit of a call to action for us to understand where our current legislative processes are and where we might think of where we want to be in the future. So with that, I would like to bring up Gabe so we can talk about flintknapping.
So forgive me, I've been a bit distracted with a family health issue the past few days, so it's maybe a little bit scattered. But so to start with, Anin, Boser, Jaunagabo, Indigenous Peoples, Negigin Godem, the China Mamma sing in Bunjaba, Chimna sing Jono Gigabig, Maraboa Sabin, Otherway coming, Wabanong in Bunjaba. So my name is Gabriel Lamarche. I grew up around the shores of Georgian Bay on Lake Huron, and I'm happy to be here today on the territory of my Western relatives. So before I get too far into the nitty-gritty of flintknapping, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of my perspective on archaeology. So growing up, I had always heard that the Abenaki on the East Coast were our relatives, or as we would pronounce it, Wabanonge, the Easterners. And I had heard that the Shawnee were our relatives, Jawanonge, the Southerners. And when I heard that word Cree, I used to always think, wow, that hard R sound. We don't really have that in our language. Those people must be really different, maybe like the Iroquois, really different. And then when I actually moved out here, I realized, oh, they don't have that R sound at all either. In fact, their language is very closely related to ours. They're almost the same. And as I started to learn more about the Cree language, I started to better understand that the similarities aren't a coincidence, that there's a deep historical relationship here. And that these languages, they may be quite divergent from each other, maybe about as far as English is from German, but there is a deep historical relationship here, well evidenced in the language. When I was growing up, I used to hear about the oral histories about our old migration stories. We had stories about the westward movement of people, and different people had stopped at different areas along the Great Lakes, and others had continued further west. And it was quite a shock for me to, come out here and see firsthand, oh my goodness, these are those Western relatives that, the oral history wasn't just a story. Here they are. And so a lot of my fascination with archaeology relates to understanding that older, deeper relationship of how we relate to each other. And a big part of it, really, a lot of the words are quite similar, astoundingly similar. Ottawa, trade, Boyas, meat, Boyan, animal pelt, Asani, stone, Hosiwood, sickness, Mashkiki, medicine. And the more and more I learned, I started realizing, the things we have in common are the basis of a trade relationship, of a trade language. And Then we look at the history of the Hudson Bay, the Hudson Bay Company that spans across the territory there. And oh, wow, yeah, the Hudson Bay Company just tapped into this pre-existing trading relationship. And so, for me, I also see those trading relationships reflected in the stone tools. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about some of them here. So to start with, this is it's almost a uniface. Technically, it's a biface. It's found, I think, southeastern Saskatchewan. And it's a material that's quite unlike anything here. It's a nice, large, nodular chert. You can almost make out there's a bullseye pattern in the middle here, which suggests it came from a spherical nodule of chert. There was a large bulb of percussion right here, but it's been reduced down. And so this was probably split with large hard hammer percussion, split the nodule into a workable piece, and then one half was worked down unifacially. It looks a lot like what we might call a Hopewellian or Nadina cash blade. So this is an archaeological culture that formed along the Great Rivers, coming up the Mississippi, up the Missouri. Complex trading relationship. It wasn't just one ethnicity. It was probably a multipolar, many different ethnicities engaged together. And the material itself, from the fine sort of inclusions of quartz, and especially this brown wart surrounded by a light blue quartz. This looks a lot like hornstone from maybe Indiana or Kentucky. And that would be the heartland of Hopewellian culture. And so, this piece, how it wound up all the way up here, right? Must have traveled thousands of kilometers upstream, up the rivers, and was laid to rest here in Saskatchewan. Yeah. Lighting. That relationship I was talking about in the Algonquian language family, that's just one trading relationship and one migration. But over the past 10,000 years, there have been many trading relationships and many different movements of people. And so this here is, what we would call a Hell Gap projectile point. It's probably 9,500 years old, maybe wiggling over 10 a little. This style is a little bit rare here in Saskatchewan. It's more common a little bit further west, a little bit further to the southwest towards Wyoming, Montana area. And in fact, even the material it's made from, this is what we call fused shale or porcelainite. It forms between coal beds when there's clay trapped between coal beds, and then the clay is set alight either through a wildfire or a lightning strike, and the coal burns inwards, and it sort of forms the clay into a natural porcelain. So that's why we sometimes call it porcelainite. So we don't have a whole lot of clay beds around here. There is a little bit towards Estevan, but it's more common further west and further southwest, southern Alberta maybe. So again, yes, for this to show up here, hundreds of kilometers away from the original site where the stone was quarried from, there's that long distance movement. In fact, we find that's quite common, going back 9,000-10,000 years, a lot of the Scottsbluff projectile points we find in Saskatchewan and earlier points as well, they tend to be made out of lithic materials from elsewhere. Knife River Flint, of course, that's the big one. Others as well. And these trade relationships were, essentially maintained over the millennia. It's such a high quality material. Yeah. That's one of the things we often have this perception, just people in the past were, just made a living from whatever was around them. But in truth, people could make do with what was around them, but in truth, long distance trading has been a core part of subsistence going all the way back. And as well, there's just that perception, you just find a rock in the ground and you start to hit it, and shabam. But no, it's a lot more complicated than that. So to start with, this is one of the mainstays of the archaeology in this region, Swan River Church. So this material formed in the Manitoba Escarpment sometime, some 70 odd million years ago. Some hydrothermal vents punched up through the limestone here when there was that inland sea, the late Cretaceous covering this area. And around the sides of those hydrothermal vents, unique sort of nodules formed. And so these nodules were then millions of years later, but still thousands of years ago to us, redeposited by glaciers in a sort of southwesterly smear as successive waves of ice ages wore down that limestone and slowly freed those hard nodules. And they are quite hard. In their raw state, they are nearly unworkable. But ancient people in the neighborhood of 10,000 or more years ago figured out that you can thermally alter this material. And so what you will do is start to very slowly and carefully roast it in the heat treating process. Sometimes we just imagine that people just threw the stones in the fire, but it was very careful and controlled process. People would first carefully raise the temperature to around the boiling temperature of water and hold it there for a while to dehydrate the material. And the reason you have to do this is because if you heat it too far above that, all of the little bugs and voids inside the material that trap moisture, that steam has to go somewhere. And it will fill the stone with crazing and pressure fractures. And so after the stone was carefully dehydrated, then again, the temperature could be raised slowly higher. It has to be raised slowly, otherwise the thermal expansion of the material, as the material swells as it expands, will kind of press against itself. If the outside expands quicker than the interior, and will again create crazing fractures. So people had to very carefully and slowly roast this material in order to be able to work it. And so that alone is many, many hours of processing. Not even to get to the reduction. Once the piece starts to be reduced, the fractures behave a little bit like glass. You know, if you've ever seen knock out that perfect cone in a window with a BB, or if a pebble hits the old antique windshield, that sort of conchoidal fracture. The reason this occurs is because the material is strong in compression, weak in tension. So the force enters in the material, radiates out, and everywhere that's under compression tends to remain intact. But at the outward edge of that expanding cone of force, there's tension. That's actually where the material fails. That's where the fracture occurs. And so in order to reliably break the stone over and over and over in exactly the ways you want, people had to be very careful with it. There's lots of little rules and subroutines you can apply to it. One interesting one is a center line of mass. So as you look at this piece, you can draw a line that bisects through the center of the mass. And you generally don't want to apply force above that center line of mass. It's because as the force radiates out, it'll be compressing a very large area. Interestingly though, on this piece, it violates that center line principle, but there is an asymmetry in the resharpening of this. Yeah. So it's probably a knife. This one makes me grin. This one I see and I see, that's something familiar. So this is not a terribly ancient piece. This looks a lot like some of the work of Mactussinger. He was a Wendat Huron man down in Oklahoma. In the very early 1900s, he was an expert flintknapper, but at a time when archaeologists knew almost nothing about flintknapping. And he would pay the boys in his neighborhood to bring him bifaces, and he would rework them into complex shapes, and he would sell these to doctors and lawyers. He would tell them all that it was about this is from the Mayan site in his backyard, and he kept this going for a long time. The problem was when he moved, the site moved with him, and that gave him away. But yeah, it's there is a continuity in flintknapping from ancient times to today, through certain individuals like Mactussinger and Ishi. Well, questions? Okay, thanks, guys.
Move some things and then.
Can tell us about Ishi?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. You can read about it in the book, although. Okay, so Ishi was I think he was a Yahi man. So he was found in a barn. I can't remember the small town it was in California in about 1906. He was an Indigenous man who was found in this barn, and he was called at the time by newspapers the last wild Indian. So his people, when the California genocide happened throughout the 1800s, his people fled up into the mountains in California and had lived in relative isolation, and slowly, being alone up there, not having those trade relationships, his family began to suffer, and slowly members of his family had died off until Ishi was the last of his line. So Ishi came down out of the mountains, and he was found in a barn on the outskirts of a small settler town. And so he was arrested, and then so they weren't sure what to do with him. If he had come down 15 years prior, he might have just been shot on sight. But he was eventually taken to the University of California, and there he was studied. And when I say studied, I mean anthropologists at this time, academia in general had started to realize that this is something special, this is worth preserving. So they made many recordings of him, his traditional crafting techniques. He practiced flintknapping with the full finesse of his pre-Columbian ancestors. In fact, his points are very similar to some of the points that are found just a bit further north from that are 800 to 1,000 years old. It was recordings of his work that were then studied by subsequent anthropologists that in many ways sort of revived the transmission of napping again through the generations in North America. He was a vast reservoir of knowledge and so many things, so many particularities, exactly, the gripping of the bowstring, so many details. Because he had lived his life, relying almost entirely on his own bows and arrows he had made himself that had the full complexity of the ancient archers. And one of the things I find almost, this is most exemplar of Ishi is that his name, Ishi. Almost everyone who spoke his language had died, Yana people, but the Yahi people. But further north of him, there was a group of Yana people that had a closely related language. They could understand him much in the same way a Polish speaker might understand much of what a Ukrainian speaker is saying. And so through him as intermediaries, people were able to communicate with him, and he eventually learned some English. But that name, Ishi, that word actually just means man in the Yano language. He said it was the custom of his people that one must always have an intermediary make introductions, that it's wholly improper for someone to introduce yourself. And he said everyone that knew his name was dead. So he's just a man. So yeah, I often wonder what other knowledges he was forbidden by ancient taboo to tell us. But I'm grateful for what we have learned from Ishi. Yeah, he was a master flintknapper.
Any other questions?
If you could pick any raw material in the world, what would be your most ideal piece for flintknapping?
Let's do an onion. Okay, so I'm going to start in Saskatchewan. Grounded siltstone. Grounded siltstone by far. It is waxy. It is brittle. It is light. It is like when you heat treat chert, you want it to wind up like grounded siltstone. It's already there. It's thin. It's tabular. It doesn't take much force. It's easy on the wrists. Grounded siltstone is the local. Oh, that's the best. It doesn't make the most durable tools, but in terms of just the joys of flintknapping, it is a joy. Further out, not a big fan of most Alberta stones. Sorry, guys. In BC, there's a wonderful fine grained volcanic in around Kamloops, Cache Creek area, more towards Ontario. Onondaga is wonderful. It smells, but it's a good challenge. Yeah, I don't know. That's like one.
Which child do you like?
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess for people who might be watching, I just wanted to mention that the book is available here at McNally. It's also available on our website, and that just the proceeds from the book go back to our organization to deliver programs for archaeology outreach that we do to communities, individual students. And so it also supports the SAS in terms of what we're able to do. And it's a good read. So
Oh, you're not done.
So you have a new appreciation for stone tools now over fossil remains.
No. And I will explain why. So why I like faunal remains better is because they were from living, like in my mind, living, because stone has spirits too. But it's more about how archaeologists understand the artifacts that they work with. So for faunal remains, I know that bone comes from a specific animal. It comes from a dog, or it comes from a bison, and it comes from a certain bone, no matter how small it is. It can be like the size of my thumbnail, but it comes, our classification schemes don't influence as much how we understand it. And so that's what I find challenging with things like lithics and pottery is as archaeologists, how we conceptualize and interpret the artifacts that we're looking at greatly influences how we understand them. And there's so much, I don't want to say ambiguity, but I don't know what the right word is. It's messy. I like putting my things in nice little boxes, right? So, and stone tools, because archaeologists bring their own perspectives and their own interpretations into everything they do. There's a lot more room for that, and things where and you'll see it in the book too, where things don't fit into the categories, right? Points don't fit into a Basant point or into a Pelican Lake point. And I don't like that stage, but that is humanity. That is people. So I still kind of like bones, but we do use projectile points kind of as our key markers. So it's the reason why this was the first book.
You keep mentioning the first book. What's the next book gonna be?
Well, we're thinking about that and whether we want to do make this a series of different artifact classes. So whether we do a pottery book and a mono book and a historic book. With the purpose of the books being around identification, and so that's something else we really I never talked about it earlier, but you'll notice there isn't a lot of interpretation of the different point types in this publication. And again, that was very deliberate. If we wanted to write that book, that would be a very different book. It would be a lot longer. It would be a lot more research and expertise. So it's really around identification guides to help all different audiences so that it works for students, new people new to archaeology will pick it up. Interested public, it would be good for museum curators. A lot of community museums in our province have archaeological collections, so it would help them with their identification. Collectors, we have people that have those collections.
Tomasin,
Yes.
if you go ahead with another book, what would be some lessons you're putting us on together?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I'm the only one to answer this, but I think recognizing that it takes time, like, so it would be about building those relationships. And I think that is probably one of the best lessons we learned, is that we don't want to rush it just for the sake of it being finished. And it will, if it's meant to be, it'll happen. So that really came out with this book. Does anyone else, Gabe, do you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, yeah. I mean, kind of as you said, the time to build. Yeah, the time to build a relationship and get everyone comfortable. And it also was really helpful. My God, Faith was like incredible. She just pushed ahead, right? Every time a lot of us were humming and hawing, Faith was pushing ahead. It was amazing. So to have Faith or someone like Faith and to be a spearhead like that's yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah, because I'll just note, like, this was in addition to the program, all the other work that we're already doing. So it's not like we had a dedicated, it was having that dedicated person that we absolutely have to have if we're going to do something like this. There has to be an editor. And I think the other thing that we learned too is that we want to compensate people fairly for the work they do. There was some discussion about having people volunteer their time to write the articles, and we kind of push back against that as a nonprofit working in the nonprofit sector. We get that a lot of expectation that people will volunteer their time and their expertise, and we're always very appreciative of people who do that. We have a wonderful board who volunteers their time. We have members like Frank volunteers so much, he got a medal for it. But it was really about making sure that the artists, the graphic artists, the authors were all compensated for their work and their knowledge.
All right, if there are no more questions, we'll receive it recorded here. All right, thank you so much for being here to the SAS, Gabriel, Tomasin, and Melinda. We've of course got copies of Points of View available for purchase on the table there. And for our virtual guests, the book is available online at mcnallyrobinson.com. I believe the SAS members are going to stick around and chat about SAS things. And thank you for joining us and have a wonderful night.